No mai haere mai, ki roll taurua, LCA 2022. Kia ora koutou, ko Joel tēnei. My name is Joel. Welcome back to day 2 of LCA's sessions. We have Florian with us here. Florian runs the Education Business Unit at City Network and has worked exclusively with open source software since about 2002. Florian has been involved with OpenStack and Ceph. That's actually how I think I first met Florian a few years ago at an OpenStack summit for my sins, and is involved with the Open edX educational project since around mid-2015. Florian's going to be talking and covering the basics of stereoscopic imagery and projection. So we're going to discover how stereoscopic vision works and how we can trick our brains into perceiving depth from two flat two-dimensional images. This is not Florian's first time at LCA, but this is his first without suffering through jet lag. You can also get the slides for today's talk, which someone will pop into the chat. They have in-depth notes and some details that will go along with the talk today. No mai, haere mai, Florian. Ha!
Thank you. So this is my introduction to stereoscopic photography and videography. And I do want to start this talk with an important note on accessibility. So some of this talk does assume that you have functional vision in both eyes. You will, of course, be able to see the images and the examples in this talk if you need to wear corrective lenses. I certainly need to wear them too. But if you do happen to have very bad vision or blindness in one eye, then by the very nature of this topic, there's some things that you won't be able to follow, some examples that you won't be able to follow, and I do apologize for that. There's also a specific condition called stereo blindness, which means that even though both your eyes are completely functional, you're unable to perceive depth. So if you have that condition, then this talk might still be informative. Stereo blind people have seen this talk and then subsequently told me that they took away quite a bit from it. It just might not be as immersive as it might be for people with stereo vision. And likewise, if you happen to have nystagmus or strabismus, some of those limitations might also apply, and possibly also if you're using an artificial lens implant, which is common after cataract surgery. Again, I do apologize for that. In this case, by the very nature of my topic, there's unfortunately very little I can do to alleviate that. However, even if you yourself cannot see stereoscopic images and videos, this talk does contain suggestions on how to make them, which you can totally do even if you're making them for somebody else. So with that said, let's first get started with what stereoscopic vision, or stereopsis as it's called, really is and how it works. So first of all, what we need in order to visually perceive depth is two eyes, and more specifically, two forward-facing eyes. So this is something that we humans have in common with, say, cats or foxes or owls, that our eyes sit sort of on one side of the skull, facing what we call forwards, and they provide fields of view that overlap to a great extent. And that, of course, comes at a cost, namely the fact that our field of vision is relatively narrow. So if you compare that, for example, to the field of vision of a horse, where the eyes sit on the side of the skull, the animal has almost 360-degree vision. It only has a small blind spot directly to the rear of the skull. And that's, of course, because a horse's evolutionary survival technique is flight. So it's an herbivore, and basically the sooner it can see a predator, it can take flight, and then it can live another day. So it's kind of optimized for that. We humans are predators ourselves and omnivores, and we have evolved to sense depth. And that, of course, greatly helps us in hunting, particularly because we've also evolved brains that enabled us to make tools. So if we make something like a spear or a lasso or a kylie or bow and arrow, and we have an animal to throw or shoot it at, then it greatly helps us to be able to sense intuitively, but still pretty exactly, how far that animal is away from us. So how exactly does that work, and what in our eyes and brains actually makes us sense depth? And the first faculty that we need in order to perceive depth is the faculty of vergence. So vergence is the ability to align the axes of our eyeballs, so our line of sight as we call it, align them and essentially make them intersect pretty much arbitrarily in any point in space in front of us. we might also be able to not make them intersect, like when we stare aimlessly ahead, but we can't really diverge our eyes, but we can converge them almost arbitrarily. And you can try that out. Most people will be able to stretch their arm out and then look at their fingertip and then bring the finger all the way into the tip of the nose and still look at the fingertip while you're doing that. And that might be very uncomfortable because it makes you very cross-eyed and you're not going to be able to hold that for very long, but most people will be able to do that. So we can converge our eyes almost arbitrarily to a very extreme degree. And the second thing that we need is accommodation. Vergence gives us the ability to point both our eyes at one point in space. And the other thing that we need for depth of vision is accommodation, which is the ability to either stretch or to relax the elastic lens in our eye, so the thing that sits right behind our pupil, and do that in such a way that there's a specific point in space or a specific plane in front of us that produces a sharp image on our retina in the back of the eye. And commonly, the point where we verge and the plane where we accommodate, those intersect. So we're kind of looking at the same spot in space in front of us using both of those things. But we don't have to do that, and we'll get to that in a second. But what that means is when we are looking at something, our eyes fundamentally produce two images, and these two images are pretty much exactly identical in one spot. So the spot that we verge on, and then they're slightly different anywhere outside that spot. And this is what we call binocular disparity. And through what has to be an inordinate amount of trial and error and faceplant in our infancy, what our brain learns is to interpret these disparities between the two optical inputs as cues about depth. And it's by these differences that our brain essentially builds a depth map of our surroundings. So now that we know how real depth perception works, meaning how our eyes signal to our brains that an object is at a greater or a lesser distance from us, we can talk about how we can trick our brain into seeing depth when objectively there is none. So taking two two-dimensional images and then making our brains conjure up a three-dimensional image from that. So, for example, I've got two-dimensional images here, and this one might correspond to what your left eye sees, and this one corresponds to what your right eye sees. So here's an example of such an image. Don't worry for now about how we make those and how we make that happen. We'll get to that in a jiffy. But the next thing that we need to talk about is stereoscopic projection. And stereoscopic projection is about making your left eye see only the left eye image and making the right eye see only the right eye image, so that your brain then puts everything together for an illusion of depth. And there's multiple ways of doing that. So I'll start with something very low tech, a stereoscopic viewer, or simply a stereoscope. I happen to have one here. Let me swiftly explain how this works. There is a little slider here, and then you take a print of a stereoscopic image that you put in here. You close the device so that the print is jammed in place and can't move about. You bring the whole thing up to your face, and then you can look through the eyepieces. And there's something important that you will see if you look at this little device from this angle, which is there's a little black separator. Let's see here, right? There's a little black separator, and it ensures that my left eye can't peek over at the right eye image, and my right eye can't catch a glimpse of the left eye image. This, by the way, is called a Brewster-type lenticular stereoscope, and this was popularized by a chap named David Brewster in 1849, so it's about 180 years old. So that's a very low-tech device here. Slightly more high-tech is a stereoscopic projector. Now, stereoscopic projectors came along for slides in the 1950s, 60s. So the principle is this: you've got a magazine of left eye images, you've got a magazine of right eye images. You put them into this projector, and they get projected out via two different lamps, two different projectors, and they're polarized. The light they emit is polarized oppositely. And then you wear goggles so that the stuff that is for your right eye that's polarized one way is hidden from your left eye, and the thing that's polarized the other way that's for your right eye is hidden from your left eye. And there are, of course, digital versions of this as well. They are available to this day. There's also 3D TV, which is a similar concept, except that you're not using two projectors, but you're using a TV screen. You've got one row of pixels that, or one line of pixels that emits light polarized one way, and then the next line, the next row, emits light polarized the other way, and then you wear goggles, and then that picks everything apart again. But that too has a downside, just as with the polarized light projectors. It's pretty involved on the technology and logistics side, right? You might need projectors, you might need a silver screen because you can't project polarized light onto a white wall. That doesn't work. It messes up the polarization on reflection. You might need a big screen TV. Your audience needs goggles, etc. It's all very much non-trivial. But what if instead we could employ a technique that requires none of that? No special projection equipment, no goggles, no nothing, where you can literally hang your stereophotography in a gallery and visitors could just scroll through and look at your images and see them in full depth. And such a technique does exist, and we're going to focus on it for the rest of the talk, and it's called free viewing. And it comes in two flavors. Now, free viewing in general means that we can take two stereoscopic images and we look at them using a certain technique that requires no stereoscope, no projector, nothing. All that you do need is two functioning eyes. And like I said, there are two flavors of free viewing, and there's one that's easy to explain and understand, but somewhat difficult to do. And there's another one that's a bit more complex to explain and comprehend, but easier to do, at least for most people. And I'll start with the one that's easier to explain, and then we'll move on to the one that's easier to do. So the first one is called wall-eyed free viewing, wall-eyed stereoscopic free viewing, or sometimes called parallel view. So what I have here is a print of a stereogram. So it's the same image as the one that I showed you earlier that jammed into my stereoscope. It's just blown up a bit, right? Again, the left eye image is on the left, the left eye image is on the left, the right eye image is on the right. So if I were to hold this up in front of you and you were just looking at this thing, then normally what you would do is this. Your vergence and accommodation points would sit right on the surface of the print. So in this graphic here, the dashed line is the surface, so that would be the surface of the photo that we're looking at. The dots are eyes. The converging lines are the lines of sight that meet at my vergence point, and the arrow represents my accommodation. So that is the plane whose distance I set my eyes to. So if I were to look at this thing, or if you were to look at this thing, it would look like this. That's what your eyes do naturally. But they don't have to. Because what you can also do is you can, instead of looking at the surface of the print, you can look at an imaginary spot behind the print. Or whatever surface it is that we're looking at. Just an imaginary spot behind that surface, while maintaining your accommodation as it was before. And if you do it just right, then what's going to end up happening is your left eye looks just at the left eye image and your right eye looks just at the right eye image. And then what you see is one image that overlaps, that's made from both those source images, and that magically has depth. And I have an example up for you next, so you can try this out. So I don't know if you're watching this on a full-size monitor or a laptop screen or a big screen TV or your phone, so you may have to play with the distance between your screen and your eyes a little bit, but the principle is in general the same. What you want to do is you want to look over the top edge of the screen at a spot in the distance, say a spot on the wall, picture on the wall or something like that. And that what you want to do is you want to try coming down just a little bit with your eyes so that you look at the actual image and not change the spot that you're looking at in the process. And then what's going to happen is that the left eye image is going to be right in the line of sight of your left eye, and your right eye image is going to be right in the line of sight of your right eye. And what's then going to happen is that rather than seeing these two images, you will actually end up seeing three. A left one, that's blurry, a right one, that's blurry, and then a center one from the other two overlapping, that's sharp, and that magically has depth. So if you're not watching this live, if you're watching this on the recording, then now might be a good time to pause the playback and perhaps give this a few tries. For now, I leave it up for a few more seconds. You can simply try that out. Again, spot on the wall behind the picture, bring your eyes down so you look at the picture and try not to look anywhere but distance-wise, but where you were staring at before. But if this doesn't work for you, please do not fret. Like I said, this is the more difficult method, and this is the one that actually works for fewer people, let's put it that way. And I'll get to the one that's easier for most people, including myself actually, next. All right, so if any of you have managed to do this, congratulations, and we'll move on now. Because the next option that you have is cross-eyed stereoscopic free viewing, or cross view. So here's how that works. What you do is, and you're probably already guessing that, right? In a wall-eyed image, so parallel view, our vergence point is behind the print, while we're maintaining our accommodation on the plane of the print, or the plane of the surface. In a cross-eyed image, it's in front of the print, so graphically, it looks like this. And what that means, of course, is that now your right eye looks at the image on the left. Your left eye looks at the image on the right. So a cross-view stereoscopic image is actually reversed. So a camera takes these pictures and then you reverse them. And the interesting bit about this is that this is easier for most people to voluntarily do. I don't really know why, but it's certainly true for myself as well. So what you want to do, if you haven't done this before, on the next image is you want to cross your eyes really hard. It means you're totally overdoing it, but that's totally okay. And then you want to let your eyes settle back to normal. And chances are that what's going to happen is by the time your eyes cross just to the point where everything falls into place, you get such a strong stimulus in your brain that your brain really doesn't want to let go, and then you see the depth image. So here, like I said, for most people, the next image will actually be easier than the one that I just showed you. It's exactly the same motif. It's just the sides are reversed, right? And again, if you're watching this on a recording, feel free to pause the stream here, pause the playback, and try this a few times until you get the hang of it. Most people will be able to do this. And by the way, when you initially try this, it might actually help that you're using an image that's relatively large, so it covers a rather large fraction of your field of vision. Once you get the hang of it, it doesn't matter. Once you get the hang of it, you can do cross view on an image that's this tiny, no problem. But for learning it, it's probably a good idea to start with a big image. So again, what you want to do is you want to stare at this image, cross your eyes, and then let your eyes come back to normal. And at some point, if you're lucky, things are going to click into place. Again, most people can't do this on the first try, but if you give it a little time, and I'll actually shut up for a few seconds now, so that you can try this out, most people will eventually succeed at this. And just in case I'm making the AV team nervous, yes, I'm still here. It's all good. And if you actually manage to get the depth effect, what's going to happen relatively quickly is you're going to be able to see the relative depth of, say, these trimmed boxwood bushes. You're going to see what the distance is to the various people in the image. You're going to be able to see the depth of the stairs. You're going to be able to see the depth of the columns. You're also going to be able to see how far the ridgeline, or actually the two ridgelines are that are behind the building. And if any of you manage this now, unfortunately I'm unable to look into the chat right now, but I'm really hoping that some of you succeed at this, because when it works, it's a really sort of satisfying feeling. So of course, I'm not going to assume that you're watching this through a 3D projector, and I also cannot assume that you have a stereoscope at hand. So from now on, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to default to free viewing, and I'm going to default to cross-eyed free viewing specifically. So now that we've seen what stereograms are, and we've hopefully learned how we look at them, let's talk about how we make them. And as you can imagine, there are multiple ways of doing that. So the first thing that I guess a lot of you might think of is, well, maybe I need to put a special lens on my camera, and such a thing totally exists. So there are stereoscopic lenses. So for example, the next one that I'm showing here, this happens to be a discontinued product, but this is a stereoscopic lens that you can just put on a camera. So you use it like any other prime lens, so you can do autofocus, auto exposure and whatnot. And it will create two stereoscopic images in one frame. But if you look at this, you'll also quickly realize that this has a flaw, which is that the two lenses are extremely close together. They're much closer together than human eyes. So that means this will make the pictures heavily hypostereoscopic. So hypostereoscopic is when the stereoscopic distance, that is to say the distance between the two lenses or the two spots in space where we took the images, is a lot less than the image between your pupils. So the distance between your, the distance between your pupils. The distance between your pupils is approximately 70 millimeters. And in this case, the lens has a stereoscopic distance of maybe 10 millimeters. And what that means is that the stereoscopic effect that you're getting from these is a lot less pronounced. You'll get a lot less depth than you'd perhaps expect. This sort of lens is still interesting for doing macro stereo photography. So you would combine this with a macro ring, for example, and that can produce really, really interesting results. So for example, I've taken macro stereo shots of tiny shells, and that's very interesting. But sort of for general purpose use, this doesn't really work too well. But there's the next step, which is this thing here. I actually have a prop of this because I happen to own this thing. So it looks like this when it's attached to a camera, right? And this thing, as you can see now, that has, if I hold it up to my face, that has roughly the same distance as my eyes. And this is something that we call isostereoscopic, or roughly isostereoscopic. So this thing here has a roughly 90 millimeter distance, stereoscopic distance, and that compares relatively well to the typical 70 millimeters that you have from your eyes. So pictures that you take with this sort of lens, the depth effect will roughly match your natural stereo distance. And then there's one other thing that you can use, and those are mirror lens attachments. So for example, this is called the Cooler Deeper. And this is something, it works through an arrangement of several mirrors. They're all at 45-degree angles to the plane of the sensor. So the light path is effectively deflected twice. It's kind of like this shape. And it offsets the light hitting the left half of your sensor a little further to the left, and offsets the light hitting the right half of your sensor a little further to the right. And so that makes this device slightly hyper stereoscopic. So if we have a stereoscopic distance that's larger than the distance between our pupils, we call that hyper stereoscopic. So in this case, it's about 105 millimeters. This, by the way, is really a design that's made for sort of full frame DSLRs. It also has like another small version that you can clip onto your phone, but this thing is very much made for sort of big DSLRs. But just like I can scarcely expect you to have a stereoscope in your possession or a stereoscopic polarized light projector, I can scarcely expect you to have these devices in your possession if you want to get started with 3D stereoscopic photography. And so, because I of course want to get you interested in it, I'm going to start talking about gadget-free stereograms. So stereograms that you can create with any regular camera. So I'm about to show you a stereo photography technique that works with literally any digital camera at all. So you can use your DSLR, you can use a point and shoot camera, you can use a GoPro, you can use your phone, anything. Now, I'll have to mention that this is a technique that doesn't work for candid shots and it doesn't work for action shots, but you can make absolutely stunning 3D views of buildings and parks and statues and sculptures and landscapes, and you can even do posed portraits this way. So if you have somebody that can actually sit for a portrait for you and can hold still for like 15 to 30 seconds, then you can totally apply this technique to portraits as well. And I have a small video for this that I'm going to narrate over. So this is me in my backyard taking an image of this little garden ornament that you see. And the technique is really simple. I lean on my left foot, so I've got all my weight on my left leg, I snap a picture, and then I move my weight over to my right leg and snap another picture. That's literally it, right? I'm going to give you this on a loop so you can see it a few times, but it's like really, really simple. What you want to do, weight on your left leg, snap, shift your weight over to your right leg, snap. And what that will create is two images that have a stereoscopic distance of about my shoulder width, right? So they're pretty solidly hyperstereoscopic even. And if you want to take a look at how that works or how that looks from the camera, this is a view of the Android Open Camera app, exactly the same thing, right? So I frame the shot with this little ornament in the center, click, and then I shift my weight over, and the whole shot changes a great deal, but this garden ornament stays in the center, click again, and that's it, right? So that's how I create my source images. Very simple way to create stereoscopic images. And now how do I turn those into a stereogram? So we've got two images, and now we want to make a stereogram out of that, right? They're not aligned, they're not like whatever. And we can do that in a few very simple steps. And of course, as with everything else that I'm showcasing in this talk, I'm using exclusively free and open source software. So we're going to do this with the GIMP, the GNU Image Manipulation Program. So what do I do here? Well, I've got my two images, and I open them using the open as layers function in the GIMP, right? So that will simply create two layers created from these two images. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename my layers, and I'm going to rename them left and right so that they reflect sort of what the view is. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my right layer, the one that's currently in the foreground, and I'm going to reduce its opacity to 50%, right? So that's semi-transparent. And now what I do is I use the GIMP Move tool, and what I want to do is I've got this little garden ornament that I've centered as sort of my focal point and my center of attention. And what I want to do is I want the image to precisely overlap on that little ornament. So I zoom in a little bit and I wiggle stuff around until it's just right, such that I get full overlap on that little ornament, right? Just there. Everywhere else, I don't care. And then what I do is I do a simple rectangle select because now my layers are only partially overlapping, right? And what I want to do is I want to select the portion where they overlap, right? And I do that with a simple freehand rectangle select. I'm sure you can write a plugin or a script or something for that as well. But I do a simple freehand rectangle select. And once I have that, I can use the image crop to selection option. Crop to selection cuts through all the layers, and that means I now have layers that are exactly identically sized and that have this little garden ornament in the center, or that point is precisely overlapping. And now I have to decide, do I want to make a cross-eyed or a wall-eyed image? And I want to make a cross-eyed image. So what I do now is I take the right layer and I move it to the left, right? And that creates my cross-view image. And then of course, it's invisible, so I have to resize my canvas to the layer sizes. That's trivial. And then I do one other thing. I leave a little bit of a gap between, and then I create a single unicolor layer. I usually use white or black, and then I put that into the background, because what that does is it creates this little bar in the center, and when viewing, that kind of tends to nicely frame the image and guide the eyes, right? So that's my stereogram that I've created in just a few minutes of the GIMP, and this is the result. Right, so this is a cross-eyed stereogram. Again, I'll leave this up for a few seconds. Admittedly, this one is more difficult to do than the others because the background is a little busier. But if you've managed to do a cross-eyed view of the image that I gave you earlier, chances are that you're going to do fine with this one as well. The only thing that you want to perhaps keep in mind is you want to keep your attention focused on this little orange glass bit of that garden ornament, so you can focus on that. And again, I'm going to leave this up for a few more seconds, and then hopefully what you're going to see is the depth differences between this little ornament and the lilies and the little maple tree that's growing there and everything else, and the fact that it's sort of staggered in depth and distance. And that's how we create stereograms in just a few minutes in the GIMP. All right, on to something even more exciting. Stereoscopic motion picture, aka 3D movies or motion stereograms. So there's one thing that I think is probably self-evident, right? Which is that everything that I talked about for still photography that relied on using special lenses or lens attachment or something like that, all that also goes for videography, right? Because your DSLR or any other camera, including your phone really, can do video just as well as still. So if I use this, just my regular camera, which can of course do video, and I attach this lens to it, then I get 3D video from that, right? But I'd argue that most people today will be interested in using a different kind of camera for 3D video, namely a drone camera. I don't know about you, I love aerial videography. I think it can be absolutely amazing to begin with. And now imagine shooting aerial video that's stereoscopic. Right? Now, of course, what you could do is you could build your own drone, perhaps something like a fixed wing UAV that has a wingspan of 2 meters and it has a GoPro embedded in each wing, and that would result in sort of seriously hyper stereoscopic image, and it will give you the impression or the feel of being something like a pteranodon-sized creature soaring over the earth. But there's a few issues with that, right? One, we're not all tridge. Two, it would come at significant expense. And three, you'd need an airstrip for this whole thing to sort of take off from and land on, right? So that's perhaps a bit problematic. But there's something very exciting that you can do. You can totally get 3D footage with a single camera. One that's mounted, it could be mounted on your drone, but it could also be mounted on your car, your bicycle, wherever. So let me quickly explain the principle. So you already know that any stereogram consists of a left eye and a right eye image. And of course, that also is true for motion stereogram. But I'm talking about having only one camera with only one lens, right? So imagine, let's take this GoPro here, right? And I hold it up to my right eye, right? So that's my right eye view. But if I have only one camera, where's my corresponding left eye view? Well, once I add some sideways motion, right? Sideways motion relative to where my lens is pointed, then you'll quickly realize that my left eye view is simply where my right eye view was a moment ago. And we can harness that fact in video post-production to create a 3D video from a 2D video, just as long as it includes constant lateral motion. So how do we do that, right? How do we harness sideways motion for a 3D effect? There's a little bit of very simple maths that we need to do for that. So suppose that we're shooting video at 50 frames per second, right? So that means that every frame is 20 milliseconds in duration. So therefore, if we're moving perpendicular to the direction of view, okay, so camera's pointed this way, we're moving that way. And we're doing that at even 1 meter per second, which is roughly the speed of a leisurely walk. And that, of course, also means that we're moving at 1 millimeter per millisecond. Right? So that means that one frame covers about 20 millimeters in sideways motion. So therefore, if we duplicate our stream and put the two stream copies side by side and then offset one of them by 4 frames, or 80 milliseconds, then what we've effectively achieved is a stereoscopic distance of 80 millimeters. And our pupils are 70 millimeters apart. So that's nicely isostereoscopic. If we go a step further and we're thinking about an object that goes a little faster, so say, for example, a drone, right, or a bicycle, or something like that. A car is easy, but any of those can achieve 10 meters per second, right, or 36 kilometers an hour. So when you do that, then even a single frame offset gives you a stereoscopic distance of 200 millimeters, right? Which already makes the video solidly hyperstereoscopic. And if you use, for example, a 5-frame offset, it gives you a nice giant's eye view with like a 1 meter stereo distance. And this becomes especially interesting when you're either doing linear drone flight along a roughly linear feature. So say, for example, you're tracking a coastline, or you're doing orbital flight around an object, right? So ideally one where you're orbiting above and your camera is tilted slightly downward, And I've got an example of the former of these two. So what you see here is a drone flight sequence that's shot at 30 frames per second with the camera pointing forwards and the drone flying sideways. And it's going to the right, and it's going at approximately 40 kilometers an hour, or 11.1 meters per second, right? Or put differently, this is buffering a little bit, but you can follow the video stream in the slide link that we shared at the top of the talk. So anyhow, we're going sideways at 11.1 meters per second. Camera's pointing forwards. Put differently, the drone's flying forwards at 11.1 meters per second, the camera's pointing 90 degrees to the left. It's exactly the same thing. So, and it bears mentioning that the camera doesn't need to be pointed at a 90-degree angle versus the heading of flight. We could also, for example, be pointing the camera directly shoreward and then fly at the beach at a 45-degree angle. But what matters is that we have some lateral motion and that we're able to quantify it, which saves us some guesswork. So every 90 milliseconds, the camera is laterally displaced 1 meter, and that's a nice hyperstereoscopic distance that we can work with in this panoramic shot. So how do we turn this into a 3D movie? Again, wonderful open source software to the rescue. This is my favorite video editor, happens to be Shotcut. And what you see here is I've got the same video open twice in Shotcut in my playlist. That's just a UX quirk in Shotcut. I need to do it this way because there's certain things that I can't do with one of them. But never mind, it's exactly the same sequence. So what I'm doing is I'm adding a video track for the left eye image. And note, we're again going to be making a cross view video, so this image will actually end up on the right. So I'm pulling this clip down into the track here. And then what I'll do is I'll apply two filters, very simple filters. So the first one is a crop filter. And what I want to do is I want to sort of extract out of this widescreen view, I want to extract sort of just the middle bit. And so therefore, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a crop of half the width of the whole frame. So it has an original width of 2704. So I'm going to crop it to 1352 in width, so 1352 pixels. And of course, the height stays unchanged. And then what I'll also do is I'll offset my crop by 1/4 of the image width. So that's 776 pixels that you see here. So we're chopping out, we're taking out sort of the left and the right side, and we're just leaving the middle. Okay. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a position filter to move this cropped frame all the way over to the right. Right? It's the left eye image. It moves over to the right because we're building a cross view video. Right? So that's the left eye image. Now add a second track, pull the exact same video into that track. And then we're also going to be doing a little bit of play with filters. So there we go. We're pulling that down into our track. At this point, it's identically aligned. And now we're applying the same filters. So first, a crop filter. The crop filter is going to use exactly the same parameters as with the left eye image. So we're going to reduce its size, its width to 1352. And we're going to use the middle portion. So we're going to offset this by 776. But now I do the reverse of what I did earlier with the position filter. With the position filter, I now use a negative 776 pixel offset so that this thing moves to the left, gets jammed over to the left edge of the frame. And then there's one tiny little thing that I need to do. I have this bar here that overlaps, and of course I don't want that. So what I'll do is I'll change the blend mode to add, and there we go. So now we've got the two images side by side. And now comes the magic, right? So now what we do is we take one of our tracks and we offset it by 90 milliseconds versus the other. Right? And so what I'll do here is this takes me a little bit of fiddling because at the time when I screen capped this, I didn't know the shortcut yet to make this happen in Shortcut, so forgive me for that. So I'm just positioning the playhead. I'm roughly eyeballing this to 0.09 seconds. And then once I found that, which like I said, took me a few tries, I can move and then split my tracks. So there we go. Now we're moving that one track by that offset. And now everything else that remains is just trimming. Right? We're trimming a little bit at the start, and we're trimming a little bit at the back, and then we're moving everything back to the beginning of the track, to the start of the track, to the 0 mark. Okay, so there we go. I just find another spot here with the playhead. Again, I completely eyeball this, and I split, and I trim. And now that that's done, I just move everything to the start of the track. And that's it. And now we can render this thing, and we end up with a 3D video. All right. So again, this is exactly the same principle. You cross your eyes, you let them wander out a little bit, and you wait for them to click into place, right? Again, if you're watching the recording, or maybe you're watching the original on YouTube, you probably want to pause the stream at some point and just find your spot. At the very beginning of that loop, there's a house in the middle, and that kind of lends itself to being a nice little focal point. And I'll give you this on a loop here a few times as well. I realize it's probably a little bit jerky right now. Like I said, you've got all the links available and you can look at the original footage. But in principle, this works exactly the same way as a stereo photograph. And once you get the hang of it, it's really nice because in this case, you sort of see how there's like different layers of depth in the jungle that are staggered. There's houses kind of like in between there, and they are all at like different depths. There's 2 ridge lines in the back, actually 3 ridge lines in the background, and you kind of nicely see the relative depth of those and so on. And it's pretty neat when it turns out that way. And that's how we get 3D footage of flying along a Brazilian beach with a view of the jungle with just a single camera. Now, with that, I hope I've piqued your curiosity for stereoscopic photography a little bit, and I'll have a few more stereo images here to close out the talk. For those of you who have already mastered the art of cross-eyed freeviewing, these will probably be a breeze. So this here is a shot of reconstructed Roman baths in what used to be the capital of the Roman province of Pannonia Superior in Carnuntum. Today this is about a 45-minute drive away from Vienna, 45-minute drive east of Vienna, approximately. And that gives you, when that clicks into place, that also gives you sort of a nice view of the relative depth of the buildings. There's these neatly trimmed bushes in front. There's some trees in the background, and so on. Here's another image coming up now. That apparently takes a little bit to load for some reason, and I'm not really sure why.
It's great, Florian. I'm just imagining this talk in real life at the conference, and a room full of LCAs stumbling around during the broom changeover, trying to uncross-eye themselves. We do have one question from the chat, if you've got a moment to take it. Have you tried using any of the various VR headsets that are in the market as a stereogram viewer?
I have not. But in principle, and I have another version of this talk in which I mentioned this. So basically, a VR goggle works very much the same way as a stereoscope like this, except that rather than putting a photograph, an image in here, you've got two screens, right? So in principle, it's pretty much the same thing. No, I have not used it. Like I said, like for me, this is I mean, yes, I use all these digital tools and whatnot, but for me, viewing this is sort of a low-tech hobby. I want to put this stuff sort of on my wall and be able to look at that. I know we're almost out of time. I do want to mention just a couple of more things because they're important. My Twitter handle was already sort of all over this talk. If you do engage in this sort of thing, please tag me. I'd love to see your stereo images. And there's another thing that I do want to say, which is special thanks to my former colleague, Adolfo Branges, who took the drone footage from the Brazilian beach and gave me permission to use it. And I also have a few Creative Commons image credits to share at the end of the talk. Do we have any more questions?
Yep, we have one more. How does this relate to Magic Eye books from back in the day?
Magic Eye books are called auto stereograms. Yeah, I mean, that's also, it simply creates the illusion of depth in a different way, namely by using these. Actually, they're probably called random dot stereograms. So anything that you can free view is essentially an auto stereogram, pretty much. And those are called random dot stereograms. So yes, it's pretty much similar. It just doesn't come off sort of the living object, right? But it's generated. There's also people that do things like letting GIMP build depth maps from two different views, left eye and right eye views of an image, and then creating random dot stereograms from that. But that is something that I just know exists. I haven't dabbled in it. I don't know anything about this. But yeah, it's something. It's something.
Well, it was brilliant. Considered. Thank you very much. Lots of virtual feedback was really good from the chat. Really good engagement. Everyone was trying out the cross-eyed and different methods. It was great.
Okay.
Thank you. And now we'll be back in 10 minutes after the room changeover. So thank you once again, Florian, and we'll see you hopefully at the next LCA.
Yes, exactly. Stay safe and healthy, everybody, and I hope to see you next year. Cheers.